Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Scott Brennan was 61 years old and had a routine as predictable as the numbers he organized daily at his accountant's desk in Portland, Oregon. He woke up at 6 in the morning, brewed coffee that was always too strong, reviewed emails while Heather was still asleep, and left for the office promptly at 7:30. Married for 28 years, Scott believed he knew every detail of the life he'd built with his wife. Heather was organized, punctual, predictable, or so he thought until 3 weeks ago, when the numbers started not adding up. Scott had always been meticulous about finances. It was in his nature as a professional, something that spilled over from work into his personal life. He reviewed bank statements monthly, categorized expenses, and planned investments. It was during one of these routine reviews on a rainy October night that he noticed the inconsistencies. Strange charges dotted the past 3 months, boutique hotels downtown in Portland, fancy restaurants they'd never visited together, and a jewelry store called Luminous Gems, with a charge for $1,200. Scott frowned, adjusted his reading glasses, and called Heather, who was watching TV in the living room. "Honey, do you remember this charge here? Luminous Gems, last month?" His voice was casual, but his eyes watched every micro-expression on his wife's face. Heather barely glanced at the laptop screen. "Oh, yeah. I bought a necklace for Karen. It was her birthday, remember?" The answer came too quickly, too smoothly, with none of the natural pause someone would make when actually trying to recall something. Scott had known Karen, Heather's sister, for decades. He didn't remember any birthday in September. And these restaurants? Bella Notte, the Pearl Room, they're pretty expensive. Heather laughed, a slightly high-pitched sound. "Oh, girls' nights out. Claire and I have been trying different places for lunch. You know how it is, we need to mix things up a little, get out of our routine." Scott nodded slowly, but something in his stomach turned. Claire Morrison had been Heather's friend for years, married to a lawyer, mother of 3 kids. He filed the information away mentally and didn't press further that night. But over the next few days, Scott started watching. Really watching. Heather had changed subtly. She dressed up more, even for simple errands. She wore different perfumes. And every Wednesday afternoon, without fail, she'd leave for yoga and then coffee with the girls. She always came back around 9 at night, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, with an energy Scott hadn't seen in her in years when it was just the two of them. The following Wednesday, Scott decided to test his theory. He waited until lunchtime, grabbed his phone, and called Claire Morrison's house. Claire herself answered, surprised but friendly. "Scott. What a surprise. Everything okay?" He kept his tone neutral and friendly. "Hey, Claire. Sorry to bother you. I'm trying to reach Heather, but her phone's off. Is she there with you?" There was a pause. "With me? No, Scott. Actually, I haven't seen Heather in a couple of months." "Why? Did something happen?" Scott's stomach dropped. He quickly improvised, said he must have mixed up the days, thanked her, and hung up. He sat in his parked car outside the office for 20 minutes, his hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. The pieces were starting to fit together in a painful way. That night, Scott could barely look at Heather during dinner. She chatted animatedly about her yoga session and how flexible and energized she was feeling. Every word felt like a blade. Scott ate in silence, nodding mechanically, while his accountant's mind organized facts, dates, and evidence. The next morning, he made a decision. He needed concrete proof. He couldn't confront her based only on suspicion and a phone call to Claire. He needed something undeniable. Scott spent the morning discreetly researching from his office. A search for Private Investigator Portland, Oregon, returned dozens of results. He reviewed websites, read reviews, and compared prices. Finally, he chose Linda Morales Private Investigations. The website was professional and discreet, and the reviews mentioned efficiency and impeccable documentation. Scott called during his lunch break. Linda had a firm, direct voice. She didn't ask unnecessary questions or pass judgment. She simply requested the facts, the full name of the person to be followed, vehicle description, license plate, timing of suspicious activities, and a recent photo if possible. Scott provided everything: Heather and Brennan, dark blue Subaru Outback, Oregon plate, HBX 4729, departures every Wednesday between 5:30 and 9 p.m., and a photo from last Christmas showing Heather smiling next to their decorated tree. "I'll start tomorrow, Wednesday," Linda said. "I'll document everything with photos and video. You'll have a full report by Thursday morning." Scott thanked her, gave his credit card details for the initial deposit, and hung up feeling a mix of relief and nausea. He was really doing it, hiring a detective to follow his own wife. The woman he'd shared a bed with for nearly 3 decades. The next Wednesday, Scott pretended everything was normal. He kissed Heather on the cheek as she left, wearing black leggings and a new blouse he'd never seen before. "Have fun at yoga, honey." She smiled, grabbed her gym bag and car keys. "I'll be back around 9. Don't wait up if you're tired." Scott watched from the window as the blue car disappeared around the corner. 15 minutes later, his phone vibrated. A message from Linda: "Target located. Beginning surveillance." While Linda worked, Scott tried to distract himself. He watched a basketball game without really paying attention, made a sandwich he barely touched, and reviewed work spreadsheets without absorbing any of the numbers. The hours dragged like molten lead. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart raced, but it was just work emails and irrelevant notifications. At 10 that night, Heather came home. Scott was in the living room, pretending to read a book. "How was it?" She tossed her bag on the sofa and stretched her arms. "Great. I'm exhausted, but in a good way. I'm going to shower and head to bed." She went upstairs. Scott heard the shower start and closed his eyes, emotionally drained. Thursday morning at exactly 8, the doorbell rang. Scott opened the door to find Linda Morales herself. She was a woman in her 50s, gray hair pulled into a neat bun, wearing understated glasses and a neutral, professional expression. She carried a black folder. "Mr. Brennan. I brought the report in person, as we discussed." Scott invited her in. Heather had already left for work. They sat at the kitchen table. Linda opened the folder and began laying out high-resolution printed photographs. "I followed the target as instructed. Here's the complete timeline." Scott picked up the first photo. It showed a dark blue Subaru Outback parked in front of a gym. He recognized the place: it was 3 blocks from home. The next photo showed a woman getting out of the car. Scott frowned. He picked up the photo, bringing it closer to his eyes. The woman was blonde, middle-aged, wearing workout clothes, but it wasn't Heather. The facial structure was wrong, the hair was shorter, and the body proportions were different. "This woman," Scott began, his voice uncertain. Linda kept showing photos. The woman entering the gym. The same woman leaving an hour later, clearly sweaty. Then photos of her entering a salon called Shine and Style. More photos of her leaving with fresh nails. Finally, photos of her at a cafe called Daily Grind, sitting with 2 other women, all 3 laughing and chatting animatedly. Scott flipped through all the photos twice, then 3 times. His racing heart began to slow. Confusion replaced panic. "Linda," he said carefully, "this woman isn't my wife." Linda took the folder, checked her notes, then picked up the photo Scott had provided of Heather. She compared them. Her professional composure cracked for a second, revealing genuine surprise. "Mr. Brennan, I followed the vehicle exactly as specified. Dark blue Subaru Outback, leaving the address you gave at 5:35 p.m. yesterday. She checked her notes again. Oregon plate. HBX 4279. Scott felt his blood run cold. Did you say 4,279? Linda nodded, double-checking. Yes, HBX 4279. Scott ran a hand over his face. My wife's license plate is HBX 4729. 729, not 279. The silence that followed was heavy. Linda closed her eyes briefly. Mr. Brennan, I apologize. There's been a mistake. I must have written it down wrong, or there were two similar Subarus on the street and Scott raised a hand, cutting off her apologies. He felt exhausted, relieved, frustrated, and confused, all at once. It's okay, Linda. Mistakes happen. He wasn't angry. In fact, he felt a strange, irrational sense of relief. Maybe he'd imagined everything. Maybe he was just getting paranoid in his old age. Scott paid Linda for her services anyway. It was fair, she'd worked all night. After the detective left, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at photos of a complete stranger living her innocent life, completely unaware she'd been followed by mistake. Scott laughed, a humorless sound. He was losing his mind. Making up imaginary affairs. Maybe he needed therapy, not a detective. He tucked the photos into a drawer, determined to forget the whole episode and work on trusting Heather more. Maybe she really was just doing yoga and hanging out with friends. Maybe Claire had just mixed up their get-togethers. Maybe. That same afternoon at 3 o'clock, while Scott was working from his home office, the doorbell rang again. He opened the door and his heart nearly stopped. Logan stood on the doorstep. His 24-year-old son, who worked at a tech startup downtown Portland, looked devastated. His eyes were red, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. Logan? Son, what's wrong? Scott pulled him inside, alarmed. Logan stumbled in as if carrying his own weight was too much. They sat on the living room sofa. Logan buried his face in his hands. Dad, I need to tell you something. I've been trying for days, but... God, this is going to destroy you. Scott felt the world tilt. What is it, Logan? Are you okay? Are you sick? Logan shook his head, still hiding his face. It's not me. It's about Mom. The air left Scott's lungs. He sat frozen, waiting. Logan finally looked up, tears streaming down his face. 2 weeks ago, I went to lunch with some coworkers. At that new Italian place, Bella Notte. You know it? Scott nodded slowly. Bella Notte, the same name he'd seen on the bank statements. We were sitting in the main dining area, laughing and talking. Then I looked toward the back of the restaurant, where the more secluded, private tables are. Logan paused, his voice breaking. And I saw Mom, Dad. I saw Mom sitting at a corner table, face to face with a man. And they were kissing. Not a friendly peck. It was intimate. Passionate. Scott's world collapsed. It felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He couldn't catch his breath. You're sure it was her? Logan nodded miserably. Absolutely sure, Dad. I froze. My coworkers asked if I was okay, but I couldn't speak. I kept staring, praying I was wrong, but it was her. Her hair, her face, her laugh. It was Mom. And she looked happy. Happier than I've seen her at home in years. Logan sobbed. I didn't know what to do. I've spent 2 weeks carrying this, not sleeping right, feeling guilty for not telling you, but also scared of blowing up our family. But I can't take it anymore, Dad. You deserve to know. Scott sat in silence, processing. Now all the pieces fit together with painful clarity. The bank statements. The lies about Claire. The fake yoga classes. The different perfumes. The renewed energy. It all made heartbreaking sense. What did the man look like? Scott heard himself ask in a distant voice, as if it belonged to someone else. Logan wiped his eyes. Around 50, maybe a bit older. Gray hair, neatly combed. Wore an expensive suit, the kind you see on executives. He seemed confident. Wealthy. Scott nodded mechanically. Thanks for telling me, son. I know that was hard. Logan grabbed his father's hand. What are you going to do? Scott didn't answer. He didn't know. After Logan left, Scott sat alone in the living room for hours. The house was too quiet, the clock on the wall ticked with torturous slowness. He thought about 28 years of marriage. He thought about the vows they'd exchanged on a sunny summer day when they were young and naive and believed love was enough. He thought about baby Logan, family vacations, silly arguments over what TV show to watch, thousands of shared dinners at that same table. He thought about how all of it was now tainted, contaminated, destroyed by secret kisses in expensive Italian restaurants. When Heather came home at 6 that evening, Scott was waiting. He sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him showing 3 months of bank statements with dozens of lines highlighted in bright yellow. Heather walked in smiling, tossing her bag onto the counter. Hey, honey. What's with that look? Bad day? Scott didn't smile back. He simply turned the laptop so the screen faced her. Who is he, Heather? Her smile vanished instantly. She went pale, eyes widening at the sight of the statements. Scott, what are you talking about? Her voice was thin, defensive. Scott kept his voice eerily calm. Bella Notte. The Pearl Room. Luminous gems. Hotels downtown. Who is he? Heather tried to laugh, but the sound came out strangled. I already explained, it's just girls' nights out. Scott cut her off, his voice rising slightly. Don't lie to me anymore. Our son saw you, Heather. He saw you kissing a man in an expensive suit at lunchtime, like you didn't have a husband, like you didn't have a family waiting at home. Heather's face crumpled. She gripped the kitchen counter for support. Logan. Logan told you? Her voice was barely a whisper. Thank God someone in this house still has a sense of loyalty, Scott replied, his words sharp as glass. Now tell me. Who is he? Heather collapsed into the chair across from Scott, her face in her hands. For a long moment, she said nothing, just sobbed. Finally, through tears, she confessed. His name is Richard. Richard Kemp. He's the vice president at my company. Scott felt a cold, dangerous anger rise up his spine. Are you telling me you're having an affair with your boss? Heather shook her head frantically. He's not my direct supervisor, I work in a different department. Scott slammed his hand on the table, making Heather jump. I don't care what his title is on the corporate org chart, Heather. How long has this been going on? She shrunk back. 6 months. 6 months. Half a year of lies, stolen kisses, hotels paid for with joint account money. Scott felt sick. And the yoga? Your Wednesday outings? Heather wiped her face with the back of her hand. We'd meet. He rents a small apartment downtown. For when he has to work late. That's where I went. Scott laughed, a bitter, broken sound. An apartment. How convenient. And here I was, the idiot, believing in imaginary yoga classes. He stood up, he needed to move, couldn't sit still. Why, Heather? 28 years. We built an entire life together. Raised a son. Why wasn't that enough? Heather looked up, eyes red and swollen. Because I felt alive again, Scott. Because for years our life has just been routine. Work, home, dinner, TV, sleep. Repeat. Richard made me feel desired. Special. Young again. Scott stared at her, and in that moment something inside him died. Routine, he repeated, his voice hollow. 28 years of partnership, of closeness, of building something solid together, and you call it suffocating routine. Interesting. He walked to the kitchen door, grabbed his car keys hanging there. Scott, please, we can talk, we can fix this. Heather stood, desperate. He turned to face her one last time. Fix it? You destroyed 28 years for some gray-haired executive who's probably doing the same thing with other women too. There's nothing to fix. He walked out, closing the door behind him. Heather called his name, but he didn't turn around. Scott spent that night and the next two in a hotel near downtown. He didn't answer Heather's calls or messages. He needed silence. He needed to think. But the anger didn't fade. It grew, fermented, turned into something cold and calculated. Scott Brennan was an accountant. He understood numbers, consequences, cause and effect. And he knew exactly what to do. On Monday morning, he hired Margaret Thornton, one of Portland's sharpest divorce attorneys. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, taking meticulous notes. Oregon is a community property state, she explained. But proven infidelity can influence court decisions, especially if we can show marital assets were used to fund the affair. Scott showed her the bank statements. Margaret smiled. This is gold, Mr. Brennan. But Scott didn't stop there. Over the next week, he investigated, discreetly, methodically. He discovered Richard Kemp was married. Had 2 teenage daughters. Lived in West Lynn, one of the wealthiest suburbs in the Portland metro area. He was a member of an exclusive golf club, donated to charity, and had an impeccable reputation. Scott smiled without humor. Reputations could be destroyed. He created an anonymous email and drafted a careful, factual message, no emotion, just facts. He attached copies of the bank statements with all expenses highlighted. He included screenshots showing dates and locations. He added a detailed account of what Logan had witnessed at the restaurant, without mentioning his son's name. Finally, he used LinkedIn to find Amanda Kemp, Richard's wife. She worked as a human resources consultant. Her profile listed a professional email address. Scott sent the message. 48 hours later, Richard Kemp's life imploded. Amanda confronted her husband with the evidence. There was an explosive argument that West Lynn neighbors would talk about for months. Amanda, devastated and furious, not only filed for immediate divorce but also, since she worked in HR, made sure to report her husband's extramarital affair with a subordinate, potential misuse of corporate resources. The apartment was partially subsidized by the company for executives needing to stay late, and creation of an inappropriate workplace environment to the company's ethics department. The company, fearing a lawsuit and wanting to protect its image, acted swiftly. Richard Kemp was fired for cause the following Friday, escorted from the building by security, his reputation in tatters. Heather, who had dreamed of a glamorous life with a powerful executive, watched her world collapse. Richard, facing an expensive divorce and sudden unemployment, vanished from her life without looking back. He didn't want complications or more trouble. Heather called Scott repeatedly, begging for a conversation, for a second chance. He refused. His attorney handled everything. The divorce was bitter and public. Oregon divided assets equally, but Scott's lawyer ensured every cent spent on the affair, hotels, dinners, jewelry, was meticulously documented and deducted from Heather's share in the settlement. Worse for Heather was Logan's estrangement. Her son refused to speak to her for months, shattered by the betrayal he'd witnessed and the pain he saw in his father. Heather also suffered professionally. After the scandal with Richard, she was asked to resign due to conflict of interest and poor professional judgment. At 56, after decades as a stay-at-home mom working only part-time, Heather found herself alone, unemployed, and with half the assets she'd once had. She moved into a modest apartment in Gresham, a cheaper suburb, and landed an administrative job at a veterinary clinic, earning a fraction of what the family used to make. Her friends, the social circle she'd built over decades, gradually drifted away once the truth came out. No one wanted to be associated with the scandal. Scott, meanwhile, flourished in ways that surprised even himself. The divorce was finalized in 6 months. He sold the house where so many memories had turned bitter and bought a modern apartment overlooking the Willamette River in downtown Portland. He reconnected with old friends he'd neglected during his marriage. He returned to playing tennis, something he hadn't done in a decade. He started traveling, weekend getaways to the coast, to the mountains, to places he'd always wanted to see but Heather had never cared about. A year after the separation, Scott met Patricia Chen at a professional networking event. She was an architect, 54 years old, divorced for 3 years, with a sharp sense of humor and a life perspective he found refreshing. They started meeting for coffee, then dinner, then weekend hikes. It was different. It was honest. It was healthy. Logan, who had carried so much guilt for revealing his mother's betrayal, finally found peace watching his father genuinely happy again. They had dinner together every Tuesday, a new tradition they both valued. During one of those dinners, Logan mentioned Scott's detective episode. "You really hired an investigator who followed the wrong car?" Logan laughed, incredulous. Scott smiled, a real smile this time, with no bitterness. "She did. Linda Morales. She photographed a completely different woman all night." They laughed together, a cathartic laugh. "You know what's funny?" Scott said, taking a sip of wine. "If she'd followed the right car, I'd have had proof. But maybe I wouldn't have believed it until you told me. Sometimes, son, the truth doesn't need a professional detective. It gives itself away." Logan nodded thoughtfully. "And are you okay now? For real?" Scott looked out the restaurant window, watching Portland's lights reflect on the river. "I'm more than okay. I'm free." 2 years after the divorce, Scott was in a stable relationship with Patricia. They'd traveled together to Italy, something that had been on his bucket list for decades. He retired at 63 with a comfortable pension and solid investments he'd carefully protected during the divorce. His life was simpler now, but infinitely more authentic. Heather, he heard through mutual acquaintances, still lived alone. Still worked the same low-paying job. Still dealt with the consequences of her choices. Richard Kemp had moved to another city, trying to rebuild a ruined career. Amanda, his ex-wife, kept the West Lynn house and a substantial share of his retirement savings. Poetic justice, Scott thought, when he heard. One spring afternoon, Scott was sorting through old documents when he found the folder containing the photos Linda Morales had taken, the photos of the wrong woman, living her innocent life. He looked at them and laughed. He put the folder back. It was a curious reminder that sometimes mistakes lead us exactly where we need to be. If Linda had followed the right car, maybe Scott would have confronted Heather differently, maybe the outcome would have been different. But it wasn't. And he was grateful. Because when the truth finally came, it came from the right person, his son, driven by love and loyalty. And that meant something. It meant that despite everything, he'd raised a good, honest, courageous man. And that was a victory no betrayal could ever tarnish. Scott closed the folder, tucked it into a box of old memories he rarely opened, and headed out to meet Patricia for dinner. Life went on. And for the first time in decades, Scott Brennan was truly happy. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.